Good evening, everyone. As we begin our program, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We are grateful here at UBC for our ongoing relationship with the Musqueam as we engage in the complex and continuing project of reconciliation. I ask you now to take your seats for the presentation of a brief video.
We read from history's lips the words, "Never again," and promise ourselves that if that was during our life, we would fight. We would speak out, do what is right, not on my watch, not in my life. We will draw the line and then we will hold it. Justice has a new name, and not race, gender, or sexuality. Birthplace, religion, or ability will be our dividing line. Our differences connect us. Universal human rights are here to protect us, but human rights have never come easy. Progress has always been hard fought and hard won, so when injustice presents itself, will your voice pierce the silence? Will you blow the whistle, halt the violence? Will you fight corruption and environmental destruction? Will your lips echo with lessons learned through generations of struggle? Justice has a new name, and it sounds a lot like integrity. It looks a lot like courage. So let's make our own words ring true, because that clear voice coming from those lips, well, it sounds a lot like you.
Thank you all for joining us this evening, whether you're here in person or part of our live stream audience. My name is Catherine DeVerne, and I'm the Dean of the Peter A. Allard School of Law, and it's my honor this evening to serve as your MC for this, the third presentation of the Allard Prize for International Integrity. The $100,000 Allard Prize is awarded once every 2 years to an individual, a movement, or an organization that has shown exceptional courage and leadership in combating corruption or protecting human rights, especially through transparency, accountability, and the rule of law. The Allard Prize is steered forward by the Allard Prize Committee, an independent group that is comprised of representatives from the Allard Prize Foundation and from the Allard School of Law, and the committee benefits from consultation with an international advisory board composed of members of the anti-corruption and human rights communities worldwide. I would like to take a moment to recognize the person who created the Allard Prize, our alumnus, Mr. Peter A. Allard, QC. I'm grateful to Peter for creating this important award, which plays a special role in the fight against corruption and injustice. In addition to this commitment, Peter has demonstrated tremendous support of the law school, donating $42 million over time to support a number of initiatives, including the construction of our gorgeous building, Allard Hall, and the establishment of a very significant endowment that brings unprecedented benefits to law students and faculty members, both now and for generations to come. Thank you, Peter, for your ongoing and extraordinary support of our Peter A. Allard School of Law. I also want to thank global law firm Fasken Martineau as the presenting sponsor of this year's Allard Prize Award ceremony. We're grateful for the firm's commitment to give back to the global community in this meaningful way. We have with us tonight a number of very special guests whom I would like to recognize. Mr. Allard, I've mentioned. We also have with us members of the Allard Prize Committee and the Allard Prize Advisory Board, the Honorable David Eby, Attorney General for the Province of British Columbia and MLA for Vancouver Point Grey, that's this riding, the Honorable Chief Justice Christopher Hinkson of the Supreme Court of British Columbia and other members of the legal community, Mr. Ernesto Rubarth, Consul General of Brazil for the Province of British Columbia. From our UBC community, we have with us Professor Santa J. Ono, President and Vice Chancellor, whom I will very soon invite to the podium, members of our UBC Board of Governors, Vice Presidents, fellow deans, and UBC community members. Also with us this evening, keynote speaker Mr. Glenn Greenwald. And last, but certainly not least, the Allard Prize honorees. Khadija Ismayilova is represented this evening by Mr. Kenan Aliyev. The Car Wash Task Force of Brazil is represented by 4 members, Mr. Dalton Danignol, Mr. Rusa Vasili, Mr. Paulo Galvao, and Mr. Arathide Costa. And they may tell you later how to pronounce their names correctly. And we also have representing Ms. Azza Soliman. Ms. Azza Soliman, who's unable to be with us, is represented by Ms. Iman Mandour. So a very special welcome to our Allard Prize honorees. For me, the Allard Prize recognizes the very best in humanity. It's a powerful tool for effecting positive change in the world. This evening, we're going to hear the very compelling stories of the honorees who exemplify the criteria of the Allard Prize: courage, leadership, and a deep commitment to anti-corruption, transparency, accountability, and the rule of law. Somewhere along their journey, these honorees made the decision to devote themselves to this goal. Something inspired them to seek justice, to pursue truth, to demand transparency. My hope is that the stories of the honorees will inspire our students, as well as everyone who's with us this evening and beyond, to consider what role each of you can play in effecting positive change in the world. This can happen in the big ways, like committing your life to a worthy cause you believe in, or in the small ways that you can carry out on a day-to-day basis through the daily acts of inclusion and dignity that demonstrate these values. So now, on to our program. It is my pleasure to introduce the 15th President and Vice Chancellor of the University of British Columbia, Professor Santa J. Ono. Professor Ono is now in his second year as our president, and he continues to make an impression on everyone he meets through the course of his work. Professor Ono has a long history with UBC. His father was a professor in the mathematics department here on this Point Grey campus at the moment in time when Professor Ono was born. I don't think actually on the campus, but we nonetheless couldn't tell the story that way. As a researcher in medicine and biology, Professor Ono's work involves the immune system, eye inflammation, and age-related macular degeneration. As a university administrator, he was first senior vice provost and deputy to the provost at Emory University, then was the president of the University of Cincinnati before we managed to lure him here in the middle of last year. We are very honored that he's here with us this evening. Please join me once again in welcoming Professor Ono.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Dean DeVerne, and good evening, everyone. Mr. Allard, on behalf of the University of British Columbia, thank you for establishing the Allard Prize for International Integrity. Let's hear it for Mr. Allard. This inspiring award, which is dedicated to the fight against corruption and the protection of human rights, truly reflects what UBC stands for. Here this evening, the Allard Prize is shining a light on global issues that require our attention and support by recognizing amazing individuals and organizations from around the world who devote their lives to fighting corruption and advocating for human rights. I'm honored to participate in this event, which is focused on creating a better world and a better future for all people. In order to consider the possibilities for a better world, it's important to reflect on our past and acknowledge the progress we have made over time. We were reminded of that earlier this year when the reconciliation pole was placed on the UBC campus. In fact, thousands of individuals, children and adults, came together with a number of ropes and lifted the pole to its majestic state today on Main Mall. The pole tells the story of the time before, during, and after the Indian residential school system, a system that caused so much harm for people who are in our midst today and people who are no longer with us. The pole, together with the UBC Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center, which will open later this academic year, will provide a landmark and a place to better understand the history and lasting effects of Canada's Indian residential schools. Unfortunately, we cannot change the past, but we can honestly recognize it as part of the truth and reconciliation process. In 1948, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, created in the aftermath of a devastating world war and of some of the worst human rights violations in history. It was the first time that fundamental human rights were set out to be universally protected for all members of the human race. These rights are the inherent dignities that should be afforded to each and every person, regardless of their national origin. They include the rights to equality, to an education, to life, well-being, and safety. According to the Declaration, they are the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. The effort to establish human rights is similarly reflected in constitutions, in the laws, and in the courts in countries around the world. From indigenous land claims to the fight against corrupt governments, the scope of human rights extends beyond basic needs. It encompasses a livable and sustainable planet, ethical trade and business practices, the freedom to protect and manifest one's cultural expressions, and the many other aspects of being a human being and citizen. All people benefit from living in communities that are just, equal, sustainable, and free, and infringements of the rights of some diminish the rights for all. Law schools are uniquely positioned to advance our understanding of human rights at a local, national, and global level. Furthermore, law schools provide leadership by identifying threats to those rights and to leading the fight against injustice head-on. The Allard School of Law does just that, and the university couldn't be prouder of the faculty, students, and staff of this distinguished School of Law. Through the strengths and contributions of its students, faculty members, and its alumni, the Allard School of Law is poised to become an international beacon of justice for the promotion of human rights and the fight against corruption. Thanks again to all of you. The reach and impact of the Allard Prize is felt around the world. Thank you for your belief in the law school and the University of British Columbia and our ability to carry out the ambitious vision for a better world. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those insightful remarks, Professor Ono. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nicole Barrett, and I'm the Executive Director of Allard Prize Initiatives and also the Director of Allard Law's International Justice and Human Rights Clinic. It's an honor and a privilege to play a leadership role in carrying out the inspiring vision of the Allard Prize. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the members of the Allard Prize Committee and the Advisory Board who lend their time and expertise to further the mission and aims of the Allard Prize. Please refer to your program for a listing of the individuals who are in those groups. I won't name them now. As Dean DeVerne mentioned earlier, this is the third presentation of the Allard Prize, preceded in 2013 with Anna Hazare as the inaugural recipient, and in 2015 with John Gathongo and Rafael Marques de Moraes as joint recipients. After a comprehensive nomination and selection process, this year's 3 honorees were selected from 244 nominations coming from 70 different countries. The honorees were selected on carefully considered prize criteria, which include demonstrated courage and leadership in the fight against corruption or the protection of human rights in a manner that promotes transparency, accountability, and the rule of law. Before I tell you a bit about our distinguished honorees, I would like to address some of the difficulties and controversies that often come with anti-corruption and human rights-related work. There is no doubt that many of the nominees for the Allard Prize over the years have been controversial among some groups. This year, we received a number of expressions of concern, and the Allard Prize Committee conducted additional due diligence, as is its practice. One of the roles of the Allard Prize is to spark discussion and debate about important anti-corruption measures worldwide. We welcome this debate. If you'd like to continue the anti-corruption conversation tomorrow morning with the finalists, we will be holding a question and answer session with the honorees at Allard Hall, where tonight's reception will be, from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. in the 4th floor terrace lounge. The session is open to the public, and we hope to see you there. Now, I'd like to turn and tell you a bit more about the 2017 Allard Prize distinguished honorees. First, we have Azza Soliman. Azza is represented tonight by Iman Mandour, her colleague at the Center for Egyptian Women's Legal Assistance in Cairo. Azza is a renowned women's rights lawyer and co-founder of the Center for Egyptian Women's Legal Assistance. She has dedicated her life to fighting corruption and injustice faced by Egyptian women in both the private sphere and the judicial system, and has fought for rights such as girls' and women's right to divorce and the right to inherit property equally to boys and men. She started her activism in 1995 when she was arrested after exposing the torture imposed on female members of the Islamic group. Azza has worked to support women's access to justice by using progressive interpretations of religion to influence legislation and combat the monopoly and corruption of religious institutions. In 2015, Azza was unjustly charged with unauthorized protest and public order violations after testifying against a policeman who she witnessed killing a female human rights defender during a protest. In response, she founded the Protecting Witnesses and Whistleblowers Coalition to help enhance the rule of law. Azza, unfortunately, cannot be with us this evening as her work is too threatening to the Egyptian government, which has curtailed Azza's freedom by freezing her law firms and her own private assets and banning her from traveling outside Egypt. Next, we move to Khadija Ismayilova. Khadija is represented by Kenan Aliyev, her former editor at Radio Free Europe's Azerbaijani service. As an investigative journalist in Azerbaijan, Khadija writes about high-level corruption and misuse of power in Azerbaijan for the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project and Radio Free Europe's Azerbaijani service. In 2010, Khadija exposed hidden offshore assets held by Azerbaijan's president, Ilham Aliyev, and his family, including tens of millions of dollars in real estate holdings registered to his son, $2.5 billion worth of gold and silver at Azerbaijan's Khovdar mine, and various business interests in communications, banking, construction, and transportation. In 2013, Khadija received private video footage of herself in her home from an anonymous source with a note warning her to behave. She did not behave, and she was arrested in 2014 and sentenced to 7.5 years in prison on charges that many saw as retaliation for her reports. Khadija cannot be with us this evening. Last year, the Supreme Court of Azerbaijan released Khadija on probation, but forbade her from traveling abroad for 5 years without official permission. Last month, she applied to the Supreme Court of Azerbaijan for permission to come to the Allard Prize ceremony, and we supported her application, but her petition was denied. Finally, our third honoree is Brazil's Car Wash Task Force. It's represented tonight by Deltan Dallagnol, Jerusha Vesili, Ataíde Costa, and Paulo Galvão. Brazil's Car Wash Task Force is an anti-corruption prosecution task force that has worked to investigate and prosecute some of the most powerful political and business leaders in Brazil, including the sitting president, former presidents, and senior executives of large Brazilian companies. Operation Car Wash began as a local money laundering investigation of a car wash, of course, and grew into the largest corruption probe to date, uncovering cases of state capture and grand corruption in Brazil. Its investigations have resulted in over 280 persons charged, 157 convictions, 1,563 years of cumulative jail time, and restitution agreements of over $3 billion US. The task force work has led to the most significant anti-corruption bill in Brazil's history, which recently was not adopted, but I understand they're currently working on an even better bill. And their work underscores the message that everyone is equal under the law, and even the most powerful leaders will be held accountable. Last year, the Car Wash Task Force was the recipient of Transparency International's 2016 Anti-Corruption Award. So tonight you will learn more about each honoree and what inspired them to take up the fight against injustice, corruption, abuses of power, and suppression of human rights. Before we go any further, however, I would like to introduce the person who made this evening possible, Mr. Peter A. Allard, QC. Lawyer and businessman, Peter graduated from the UBC with a BA in History in 1968 and an LLB in 1971. After graduation, Peter practiced law for more than 20 years and engaged in various business enterprises. With a keen legal mind and a passionate commitment to creating positive change, he also assumed leadership roles in human rights, environmental advocacy, and other philanthropic work. Peter, thank you for your passion in fighting corruption and promoting human rights, for your visionary leadership in the pursuit of justice, and for your support of this very significant initiative. Please join me in recognizing Peter as he comes to the podium.
Honored and distinguished guests, finalists, and guests, first of all, a huge heartfelt thanks to all members of the prize committee, especially Nicole Barrett, and to Carrie Strelowski, Max Fisher, and Lisa Dam for their tireless work. Across borders, our videographers who face extremely tight schedules, sometimes under dangerous conditions, to bring us such wonderful, inspiring stories. Tiago Rourke of Portugal for the beautifully crafted, unique sculptures. Sheraton Vancouver Wall Centre. Donald Best, one of Canada's most methodical and well-documented whistleblowers, for the much-needed assistance to the Allard Prize. And to all of our finalists and their representatives, Glenn Greenwald for his well-reasoned and articulated journalistic conversations, Jimmy Dorr, Steph Zamorano, and Jordan Chariton's associates for standing up for the 99% who bring truth to power. My generation, the baby boomers, were indirect beneficiaries of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Harry S. Truman, and Dwight D. Eisenhower's New Deal, socialism, where the economic, social, and legal needs of the mass population were addressed. Almost everyone was involved in the Second World War effort, including more than 16 million military men and women called to active duty in the United States, and more than 1 million in Canada. Very few citizens, if any, escaped the horror and tragedies of war in Canada, the United States, and the free world. After the war, major infrastructure jobs were created with the launch of massive development projects, including the Interstate Highways project in the US and the St. Lawrence Seaway project in Canada. The National Interstate and Defense Highways Act in the US raised the minimum wage, extended Social Security, and created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. While difficult in terms of federal spending, this helped fuel millions of related jobs, extra buoyancy, and allowed for a balanced budget. Tax rates soared, but everyone benefited from a balanced system of socialism and modern capitalism. However, basic infrastructure development, the engine of prosperity that needed to create our wealth, is now being forgotten, and we have not learned from history of the realities of New Deal socialism. As well, we have not learned from history when democratic principles are not vigorously and courageously defended and enforced, transparency, accountability, and the rule of law are allowed to erode. At the Allard Prize ceremonies of 2013 and 2015, I was astonished at the sacrifice of the individuals and organizations we recognize who have fought, endured, and suffered against corruption at every level to preserve what is left of our concepts of judicial, economic, and social justice. The stories were brought to life by the finalists speaking of their causes and their work, and by the brief videos prepared to depict their courage and resilience to establish right over wrong. In 2015, the co-winner, John Gathongo of Kenya, who talked about the hollowing out of our institutions and the insidious and systemic erosion of our freedoms through corruption, approached me and asked me why I had founded the prize. I gave him just a few examples of corruption that goes on in Canada and other first world countries with zero accountability and leadership by those at the top. John Gathongo said, "Oh, it sounds to me as if you have an African problem." And I said, "No, unfortunately, it's a world problem. It's indeed a human problem." Please do not confuse economic activity with the concept of democracy. Having 1% of the population holding 99% of the wealth while steadily and inexorably strangling the middle class is a recipe for disaster. The last 35 years of our existence have introduced us to the concepts of short-term gain versus long-term growth and stability, other people's money, and get what you can while you can, regardless of the greater good. Ignore the 99% and inflict severe hardships on them and deny them the ability to share the American dream. The public is aware. The old economics concept of guns versus butter, with a recent 16% rise in military spending in the US, 5 to 6% of GDP, means the day of reckoning will happen sooner rather than later. Where are all the fiscal conservatives and those who have to balance their personal and business budgets? Just since the 2015 prize ceremony, checks and balances put in place in the US 240 years ago have flown out the window at an ever-accelerated speed. The corporate media has been bought, and so have judges, lawyers, police, and other leaders in our increasingly segmented society. Those at the top must be held to the same accountability as the average citizen. Otherwise, democracy cannot resurrect itself and flourish. We are left only with internet YouTube videos to sift out the truth. Very few people are prepared to stand up and say the emperor has no clothes. And the formerly trusted Fourth Estate has dissolved into manufactured propaganda in a very frighteningly fast time. This churns the stomach. During the past 2-year period, we have witnessed the right of habeas corpus, which was granted by King John in 1215 under the Magna Carta and is reflected in the U.S. Constitution, removed in the U.S. Journalists have been jailed in the name of security under the Espionage Act. Russia has recently jailed a dissident for 3.5 years for daring to call for a referendum. In Canada, members of the legal profession and judicial system allowed a highly respected undercover investigator to go to prison for failing to appear in court based upon completely fabricated evidence. This intentional abuse and deceit upon the courts was used in an attempt to extort a settlement in a civil lawsuit and to gain information for use in extra-jurisdictional purposes. Who acts for the average citizen when this unchecked, oppressive, oligarchic, and institutional abuse takes place? That is all to say that serious corruption is alive in North America and Europe, as it is around the world, but we must not lose hope, heart, or courage. Springing up from all this economic, legal, and judicial disharmony and abuse of power are 3 extraordinary 2017 Allard Prize finalists. Car Wash Task Force of Brazil, Khadija Ismayilova of Azerbaijan, and Azza Soliman of Egypt, selected from 260 nominations from 70 countries around the world. I know you will be inspired when you hear of their stories in the video we're about to present, and when you hear their voices, they give us hope. Thank you.
Okay, we now have a video presentation of each of the finalists' work that we'll watch.
Brazil is a country with a lot to offer. Its staggering beauty, with its beaches and tourist destinations, its strong family culture, and its artful blend of the old, the new, and the innovative. But along with that comes a heartbreaking disparity between the very wealthy and the very poor. It all adds up to a crippled economy.
Rio de Janeiro is an example of Brazil, a place where heaven and hell coexist. You see heaven, the same elite, the same oligarchs, and you see the same people paying the price. And of course, this is a result of a deep, corrupt system.
But there's change afoot. For the past few years, Brazil's social, governmental, and corporate structures have been going through a major recalibration. Officials in all levels of government and industry, from the top down, are being jailed for misdeeds that involve massive money laundering and corruption, to the tune of almost $10 billion US.
It's really unbelievable. Powerful people being arrested.
It's huge. It's groundbreaking. It makes the Nixon scheme, Watergate, seems like a couple of kids playing in the sandbox.
Welcome to Força Tarefa de Lava Jato, also known as the Car Wash Task Force. This group of legal warriors in the progressive city of Curitiba are uncovering the biggest corruption scheme in the history of Brazil, maybe even the world. It started innocently enough. Black market money dealers were using small businesses, such as gas stations with car washes, to do money laundering for some of their clients. In one of those cases, federal investigators connected a small-time dealer to a big-time executive named Paulo Roberto Costa. He worked for Petrobras, a state-run oil firm, one of the world's most profitable companies.
Costa was a director of Petrobras, and we had lots of evidence against him. So he decided to make an agreement, and he told us about the companies that paid bribes and the politicians that received bribes.
When Paulo Roberto Costa decided to cooperate, there was a kind of domino effect. A lot of other people decided to cooperate as well. We were able to arrest a lot of politicians, a lot of top executives of the major construction companies in Brazil, and we are talking about people with the highest possible political and economic power.
As the list of perpetrators expanded, Lava Jato went into full throttle. They discovered that Costa and others with Petrobras had been overpaying contractors on various projects, including the massive Compares refinery outside of Rio de Janeiro. In return, those contractors paid kickbacks that helped keep the politicians in power who had first appointed them. Now came a major test of the rule of law in Brazil. What would become of all those executives and politicians who were caught red-handed? Brazil's legal system was historically hard on street crime and soft on criminals in business suits. It was time for the court of Judge Sergio Moro to step up to the plate.
The corruption was so widespread, was so systemic, that you have to send a strong message. Oh, you stop that. We will not tolerate this kind of behavior.
Moro immediately threw 20 top executives from 8 major companies in jail without bail for several months. For the ruling class, this was unheard of. And this was just the beginning. The scandal and the Lava Jato team have grown exponentially.
We are about 50 persons working together, lots of hours a day, working weekends, nights. Yeah, we work like detectives because here in Brazil, with the federal prosecutors, we can investigate also, not only the police.
Car wash case has put under investigation almost 1/3 of the senators and 1/3 of the secretaries of state. Almost a half of the governors are also under investigation. And we were able to charge more than 280 people with crimes such as corruption, money laundering, and criminal organization. More than 100 of these people were convicted to serve more than 1,500 years of jail.
Our unit makes so many arrests here that we need more space for, even for the criminals here.
Those convicted include the CEO of the contracting firm Odebrecht, who was sentenced to 19 years in prison after being convicted of paying more than $30 million in bribes to Petrobras executives. A senator who was charged with taking kickbacks. No sitting senator had been arrested in 30 years. And one of Brazil's most beloved politicians. Ex-President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was recently sentenced to 9.5 years in jail for taking bribes.
The rule of law is becoming stronger in Brazil, and this whole case, Lava Jato case, is a sign of this changing. Maybe this means that our justice will be more fair.
If we reduce corruption, we will increase our per capita income.
And because of the cooperation agreement with the defendants, they are committed to giving back more than $3 billion.
Part of that laundered money may find its way back to where it's badly needed.
This favela, it shows the reality of the vast majority of the Brazilian people. Over 50% of the population, of the households in this country, doesn't have basic sanitation. Talking about clean water supply, sewage systems. In 2017,
These persons, they don't have the basic, the health system, the education system. So you can say that corruption really kills people here in Brazil.
The public can see for themselves the enormity of the scandal at a gallery in Curitiba. All of this expensive art on exhibit was used to launder money and bribe officials, along with jewelry, fine wines, and other luxury items.
Lava Jato, it's okay for no corruption.
Lava Jato has become a work of art itself, with broad support of the public. Lava Jato bumper stickers are everywhere. Judge Moro has become a folk hero, and Delton has a best-selling book on the operation.
I wrote this book to say that we are not heroes in this case, and car wash case is only the first step.
Lava Jato is an attitude in Brazil now. It's a ray of hope, and it's an example for young prosecutors, young judges, that they can make a difference. We hope that we have success in the legal procedures, but the success of changing the mindset is already happening.
We live in a window of opportunity for changes, and we are committed to use any chance, any possibility to make things better in Brazil. And doing so is a matter that is up to everybody.
With the promise of the Arab Spring, new hope surged through Egypt in 2011, sparked by liberal, anti-capitalist, nationalist, and feminist ideals. That hope was short-lived. What seemed like positive change turned into a constantly shifting, unstable political situation, leaving ordinary citizens caught in a tug-of-war between the military, the judiciary, and dozens of political parties vying for power. The legacy of those politics hasn't been good news for women. It's made the work of Azza Soliman that much harder.
I'm fighting against the conservative mentality in Egypt. I work with women, especially in family law, and I am women human rights defenders. This is not easy in Egypt.
Over 20 years ago, Azza founded the Center for Egyptian Women's Legal Assistance. Her work is based in Cairo's worst slum, where she deals with culturally sensitive issues such as marital rape and the right for women to divorce.
The center focuses on access to justice, combating violence against women, advocacy, and providing services for marginalized women. Azza's dream is to aid and help marginalized women have a voice and have someone to advocate for their own rights. She always talked to us as team about how it is important to be in a slum area, for instance, and why is it we have this perspective of working with the communities. She believes that change will come from beneath, from within the community itself. It's not something that we should impose.
But Azza's dreams have been under siege. Egyptian society has continued to lean farther and farther to the right. In 2011, authorities raided 17 non-governmental organizations working on democracy and human rights issues. As a result, there was a huge backlash against activists. Then, matters got even worse for Azza.
In 2015, I had lunch with some friends in downtown. And in this time, I heard this peaceful demonstration, and I went outside and I saw the policeman killed a woman, her name activist Shayma al-Sabbagh. And after this, I went to public prosecutor to put my testimony about this, but they accused me as a part in this demonstration. But I am not a member in this political party. I am not part in this peaceful demonstration.
Azza became a defendant, accused of protesting illegally. Although she was eventually acquitted, she became a target. This was the first step in the authorities' efforts to destroy her. Instead of retreating, Azza was emboldened. She fought harder for enforcing and enhancing the rule of law by establishing what's known as the Protecting Witnesses and Whistleblowers Coalition. This was supported wholeheartedly by international human rights organizations.
The international support or region support, it is very important to me because this is both impression against the Egyptian government and also to help me, I am not alone.
Then in 2016 came the biggest challenge of all. Egypt's President El-Sisi put a plan into force that imposed strict regulations on NGOs, accelerating a brutal crackdown on human rights.
The current government is actually trying to attack and stop the work of the civil society organizations, our organization included. That happens because they believe that we receive funds in order to harm the national interest, for example, or to add the Western values or advocate for Western values in our Egyptian society. Which is not true, by the way. What we're talking about is human rights and women's rights.
So 2 years now, we didn't receive any fund. The government didn't give us approval for any proposal or any project. It is difficult.
If we don't receive funds, that means we cannot do the work or provide the services we provide because people either need salaries, and even if we work on a voluntary basis, then we wouldn't have the money to go and pay for the court fees, for instance. So they dry up our resources.
In many cases, NGOs were given criminal status, and Azza was no exception. Late in 2016, she was arrested at her home in Cairo, accused of tax evasion, establishing an illegal entity, and much more.
Last year when the police arrested me and they came in my home, I didn't understand. I feeling unfair. I feeling I didn't deserve this. But after this is the media put a lot of my picture in media, in TV, and this meaning invite people to attack me in the street. And this is scare me. And especially when they put some details about it, Azza Soliman take money from America, Qatar, and she has 52 million Egyptian.
So they are attacking Azza because she's very out loud about women's rights, about the rights of women in the private sphere. This is something that is dangerous for the government to talk about, because that means, or she's raising awareness in the families about women's rights.
But in reality, they frozen my account, personal, and my company, and I can't work outside, and I can work. My resource in Egypt very limited, so, and I haven't this money. So they put a lot of liars around me. Yeah, and also this is hurt my personal and my family and my sons.
Azza remains strong, but the future of her organization and of human rights in Egypt remains uncertain.
Because if I lost my hope, I can die. I am still fighting.
To an outsider, Azerbaijan puts on a glamorous and ostentatious face. But despite all the lavish attractions here, there is a dark side, a corrupt side, that keeps its citizens quietly oppressed and disenfranchised. This is a country that is petroleum rich and petroleum poor. Away from the opulence, the land is pockmarked by oil wells extracting wealth, which are surrounded by poverty and poor living conditions. Being a journalist here demands an extra amount of courage.
My name is Khadija Ismayilova, and I'm an investigative journalist. One faces corruption at every stage of their lives in Azerbaijan. It starts from the day you were born, and then at the very end, when you die, your relatives again have to pay bribe to get a piece of land where you will be buried. Corruption is not just a negative notion. Corruption is a crime that kills people directly and indirectly. There is no fair play system in this country. So what I do, I investigate hidden business interests of high-level politicians in my country.
Once part of the Soviet Union, Azerbaijan has had the largest decline in democratic governance of any part of Eurasia. The country's presidency has roots in the KGB and has become a dynasty. Since 1993, Heydar Aliyev and now his son Ilham Aliyev have remained in power.
It's like a kingdom. It's controlled by one family. They're controlling the biggest part of the economy in this country. They are controlling most of the opportunities in this country.
Khadija is one of Azerbaijan's most courageous journalists and continues to challenge the current system, despite the consequences.
I spent a year and a half in prison, and even now I'm under surveillance and I'm being watched constantly.
Khadija's problems are far from unique. Over the years, large numbers of journalists and activists have been rounded up and jailed for their criticism of the Aliyev government.
Like Ilgar Mammadov, he is in prison now. These are my criminal cases. The first rule of investigative journalism is follow the money. And Aliyevs couldn't keep the money inside the country. They spend a lot of money outside the country. They buy mansions around the world. They buy businesses around the world. For example, President's daughter Leyla Aliyeva owns a lot of mansions in London. His son and daughters own property worth altogether $75 million in Dubai. Whatever business I've been investigating, the family members' names were popping out. I discovered documents in Panama State Registry showing that our President Ilham Aliyev's family members own companies in offshores, which they use to hide their business interests in Azerbaijan. One of the investigations was about 6 gold and copper mines. The president's daughter's company got the right to dig the gold out of those mines, including one particular in Chovdar. And according to the official estimates, the reserves were worth $2.5 billion. I actually didn't only discover that the president's daughters own the company, but I also discovered that President himself ordered the Minister of Natural Resources to sign a contract with daughter's company.
Eventually, as a result of her reports, the public was starting to discover the truth about their dubious first family. That put Khadija on the government radar.
A couple days after first story on Panama companies have been published, a video camera had been planted in my bedroom. They filmed me secretly in my bedroom with my boyfriend and then blackmailed me with that video. And when I didn't step back, they posted the videos online. And that was basically the worst thing they could do to anyone, any woman in this country.
This was followed by a barrage of threats, a smear campaign in state media, as well as various criminal charges. The government wanted her out of the picture. Convicted of trumped-up charges, she was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. But this backfired. The government had no idea what they were in for.
I said, I want to be incarcerated. I like it there. And then my colleagues worldwide started a project which was called Khadija Project. Around 100 journalists joined the initiative and they started doing investigation on Aliyev's family. They continued the investigations that I've started. They conducted new investigations. They revealed new facts. And they announced that they are doing it for my freedom.
Soon after, some heavy hitters jumped on the campaign.
This is the observation paper done by my lawyers.
As her counsel, I've filed a case before the European Court of Human Rights that seeks to have the court recognize the violations that have occurred. She also benefited from support on a bipartisan basis from representatives from Congress and the Senate.
During the same period, the Obama administration had some serious discussions with President Aliyev.
First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to President Obama.
And there was the irony that Mehraban, the First Lady of Azerbaijan, was a UNESCO ambassador, while at the same time keeping a journalist in prison who had been investigating her and her daughters.
They understood that they are losing much more by keeping me in prison.
Soon, Aliyev began pardoning dozens of political prisoners. And around the same time, Khadija was eventually released and acquitted of 3 of the 5 charges. Still, she is watched carefully and cannot leave her country. And others still languish in prison while the Aliyev's family corruption and lineage continues.
I don't know if ending corruption is possible, but I will continue doing my job, exposing corruption, till the end of my life. Or, in better case, till the end of the problem.
What inspiring stories. This video will soon be available on the Allard Prize website, and it's part of a larger project of the Allard Prize to document important anti-corruption work worldwide. I now want to introduce someone who exemplifies the values of the Allard Prize, values that include extraordinary courage and leadership in opposing corruption. American journalist and author Glenn Greenwald broke the story of U.S. whistleblower Edward Snowden to the world and co-founded the award-winning news outlet The Intercept. The Intercept covers national security, politics, criminal justice, and more, and gives its journalists the editorial freedom and legal support that they need to pursue investigations that expose corruption and injustice. Please join me in welcoming Glenn Greenwald as he makes his way to the stage.
Good evening to everybody, and thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you as well to the Allard Prize for inviting me here to speak, and thank you to Peter Allard for enabling such an inspiring and important event. When I was asked to come here, saying yes was really not a difficult call at all. At least as a political matter, for me, there is nobody who's doing more important work than those people who, often at great cost and great risk to themselves, devote themselves to investigating and uncovering and stopping and smashing all kinds of wrongdoing and deceit and corruption perpetrated by the society's most powerful actors and most powerful factions. And so when I looked at the history of award winners who had been previously honored here and the finalists who had been honored as well, it was something that I was really thrilled to come and be a part of. And I have to say that as I've learned more about the Allard Prize, as I've begun to understand better, not just their past judgments, but also the foundational principles to which they're devoted and the aspirations which they're working toward achieving, it really became increasingly impressive to me, something that was even more impressive to me than I originally understood. Because to me, one of the most important developments over the last 20 to 30 years is the internationalization of virtually all aspects of our political, economic, and cultural life. There's very little left that's actually domestic in its essence. And for that reason, a lot of realms of political activism, probably most realms of political activism, have begun to evolve to recognize this reality, to develop this very internationalized and globalized discourse and activism and framework for how issues ought to be understood. You see this with human rights abuses, you see it with environmental activism, you see it with war criminality, with sex trafficking, with drugs. There's a very internationalized way of understanding these issues and trying to manage them, no longer as nation states, but really as humanity. And in some ways, the effort to fight corruption and to impose transparency and accountability has really kind of lagged behind. We really do tend to think about those people who are fighting against corruption as kind of confined to their own country. It tends to be viewed very domestically. And I think one of the revelations of this event and the organizers who have put it together that really is pioneering is trying to make certain that we think about corruption and the people heroically fighting against it as also being international in scope and the way that we ought to understand them. Because corruption really is just as international as all of those other areas that I've just described, and you can see that in the three finalists tonight in a bunch of different ways. To begin with, corruption itself at the highest levels itself tends to be international. So if you look at the work, for example, that Khadija Ismayilova has been doing in Azerbaijan in trying to trace all of this financial impropriety on the part of Azerbaijan's ruling elites, or if you look at the work of the Lava Jato investigators and prosecutors in Brazil, what they had to do was not confined to their own borders. They had to trace bribes and hidden assets all over the world. In the case of Ismayilova, she had to go and look at shell companies in the UK, go to Dubai. The prosecutors in Brazil had to try and open up Swiss bank accounts and find bribes hidden in countries all over the world. And so if there hadn't been an internationalized framework, if it had just been them working within the borders of their own country, the success that they achieved probably would have been impossible. But there's a different level, and I think an even more profound level, on which it's critical that we start to think about corruption and those who fight against it in international terms, which is why I think this award is so important in terms of the work that it's doing. There is this trend that is really taking place across the world that's very menacing. And in a lot of ways, my country played a critical role in fueling and in framing it. And that is to try and target and attack those people who expose wrongdoing on the part of the most powerful factions. And it's really interesting whenever I'm in Canada and I talk a little bit about the United States and our politics, I'm actually very comforted because I do find the situation in Canada to be somewhat analogous to some of the difficulty that I have in the United States when I talk about politics in the United States. Because here in Canada, you have a prime minister currently who is really good at giving very pretty speeches. And he himself is very pretty. And he's very good at doing things like hugging refugees in front of cameras. And so people around the world, I know in the United States especially, are very enamored of him and have a really hard time believing that he actually does anything bad or wrong. And I have friends here in Canada, both on the left and the right, and they're driven crazy by this. They say, look, we know what his image is, but he actually does some bad things that merit criticism. Don't be fooled by that. And the reason I say I'm comforted by that is because we also had a president of the United States before the current one, who also gave really pretty speeches and also was very pretty and did things very adeptly, like hugging refugees in front of cameras. And so people around the world had a hard time believing that he did bad things as well. And yet one of the things that he did that really has fueled a lot of what we just watched in this video was he pioneered all new ways of persecuting and attacking whistleblowers, activists, and journalists who were exposing wrongdoing at the highest level. And this is now spread around the world in very intensive ways because when the United States sanctions those kind of abuses, it becomes much easier for other countries to carry them out as well. And the reason that 2 of the 3 finalists are not able to be here tonight is because they have been so threatening in their work to the most powerful factions that they're literally precluded from leaving their countries. And notwithstanding all of the persecution they've endured, going to prison, having their assets frozen, being barred from leaving the country, I think the treatment that they received would have been a lot worse. And in fact, they themselves both said it. Azza Soliman in Egypt and Ms. Ismayilova said it as well in Azerbaijan, that had it not been for the international pressure placed on their governments, the punishments and persecutions that had been imposed on them would have been much more severe. And so I think it is critical that we not look at anti-corruption crusaders and people fighting against those who are deceitful and those engaged in wrongdoing as being confined to their own country. It's critical that we have the kind of international framework that has arisen in other areas. And that's why I really do genuinely say this, that I'm honored to be part of an event that isn't devoted just to honoring anti-corruption crusaders, but to constructing and fortifying a framework that really does protect them and enable the work to proceed much more safely. So I want to just talk a little bit about the 3 finalists because there's something that strikes me that I find really interesting about it, which is that at first glance, if you look at them, they're actually an extremely disparate group. When you look at them, you at first think, wow, they have almost nothing in common. To begin with, Khadija Ismayilova is a journalist, Azza Soliman is an activist, and then the car wash prosecutors are lawyers and prosecutors. Brazil itself is a democracy, albeit a corrupt a corrupt oligarchy, but it is a democracy, whereas Egypt is an autocracy, a brutal dictatorship, and Azerbaijan is, I think, best described as a kleptocracy. So you can see a lot of differences. But I think that really what defines all of them and anyone who does brave anti-corruption work are a series of very common attributes. I actually think the 3 finalists tonight have far more in common with one another than they do differences. And to talk about these attributes, I want to talk to you a little bit about the experience that I had that has really shaped how I view this kind of work and the heroic nature of it and the reason why it deserves protection and admiration. And that was the work that I did with my source, the whistleblower Edward Snowden. The work that I did with Edward Snowden really was transformative for me in so many ways, and it really illuminated so many critical issues that have shaped how I think about things that I'm sure will last for the rest of my life. And one of the reasons that that's true is for a long time before I began doing that work, I was writing a lot about the need to be adversarial to those in power, to stand up to the country's most powerful factions whenever they're engaged in corruption and wrongdoing. And what I ultimately discovered is that it's actually somewhat easy to say that, but much more difficult to actually do it when the time comes that you're confronted with it. And you don't actually fully understand what it entails until you actually go and do it and live all the risks and live all the threats and live all the difficulties and burdens and choices that you have to make. So I just want to share with you a couple of anecdotes that I think really illuminate why the work of the three finalists is so important and what binds together people who, at great risk to themselves, do this sort of thing. So when I first started talking to Edward Snowden, it was late 2012, and he contacted me via the internet. And we ended up speaking for many weeks, during which I had no information at all, no knowledge whatsoever about who he was. He was telling me, and then he had demonstrated to me that he had taken extremely sensitive documents from the most secretive agency within the world's most powerful government, which he said he wanted to share with me. And he then demonstrated that he had those. But I didn't know his name. I didn't know where he worked. I didn't know anything about him personally. I didn't know his age. I knew nothing. And in the very first conversation, the very first one that I ever had with him, he said, look, I want to give you these materials because I know that the world needs to see them, and I think you're the person who can deliver them in a way that will be effective. And I started to talk to him about ways that I could shield his anonymity, to protect the government, to protect him from having the government discover who he was. And he said, no, you don't understand. I don't want anonymity. I want to come out in public, and I want to declare who I am and explain what it is that I've done and explain why I did it, because I've done nothing wrong. And I said to him, well, that is a choice that you're free to make, but you should know that if you do that, it's almost certain that you're going to go to prison for the rest of your life. And he said, that's a risk I'm willing to take. And at the time, in my mind, I was developing a picture of him. I'm sure you've all had the experience of talking to somebody over the internet that you've never met, and you develop a picture of what they look like, and it's never anything like what they actually look like. So in my mind, while I was talking to Edward Snowden for all these weeks, I had assumed that he was an older person, probably in his 60s or 70s, in part because he was very sophisticated about what he was saying, in part because I thought somebody who'd become that jaded that they were willing to go to prison to stop what they viewed as this level of corruption had probably been around for decades, and also because I thought that somebody who was so willing to say, I'm willing to go to prison for the rest of my life, probably meant I'll go to prison for 5 years or 10 years, which is how much longer I have to live, not for 50 or 60 years. And so in June of 2013, I traveled to Hong Kong, and I met him for the first time. And he wasn't 60 or 70. He was 29 at the time, and he actually looked much younger. He looked 22 or 23. He sort of looked like a kid who worked in a video game store at a mall, just sort of this nerd in a t-shirt who kind of wandered out. And it was one of the most disorienting events of my life, in part because it was hard to believe that somebody that young had access to such sensitive information, but more so because it really made me confounded about why somebody that young would be willing to go sit in a prison for the next 60 years in defense of some sort of abstract political value that didn't really affect his life very much in a direct way. And so I actually spent 2 or 3 days in Hong Kong grilling him, interrogating him about what his actual motives were. I needed to understand why he was willing to do this. And it took a while for me to get answers that were satisfactory because he really hadn't even thought so much about it, and he was kind of reluctant to talk about himself. He wanted to talk about the documents instead. But what I finally came to understand, what he finally said to me that made me feel the authenticity and the conviction of what he was saying, he said to me, I cannot live the rest of my life knowing that I had the opportunity to do something about this grave injustice, and I chose instead, out of fear, to do nothing. And then he told me that no matter what it is that the US government might do to him, put him in prison, kill him, persecute him, vilify him in public. None of that, he said, could compete with the pain and the suffering that he would endure of having to live the rest of his life knowing that he capitulated to fear as opposed to standing up and defending the things that he believed in. And I found all of that just so remarkable, and it really was so transformative for me to this very day. And I think there's some really critical lessons that we can all draw about people who do that sort of heroic work that certainly applies to all three finalists tonight. To begin with, I think that one really valuable lesson that comes from that is that any person in the society, no matter how seemingly ordinary or average or powerless, can really change the world. Whatever you think of Edward Snowden, he changed the world. He altered diplomatic relations between countries. He radically changed the way we think about critical concepts like privacy and surveillance and government secrecy and the role of the United States and the role of journalism and democracy. And what was so amazing to me about Edward Snowden was how ordinary he was. He grew up in a lower middle class household. His father was in the Coast Guard. He dropped out of high school. He had no power, no position, no prestige. And yet, through nothing more than an act of conscience, an act of courage, he changed the world. And I think it is incredibly important to always realize that no matter how formidable institutions might seem, no matter how powerful corrupt factions might appear to be, you always have, every person has within themselves the ability to fight it and to change it. There's another aspect that I think binds all people who engage in this sort of work in common ground, and that is a willingness to endure any punishment or any consequence because of the conviction that what they're doing is right. You saw Azza Soliman talk about the way her life has been destroyed by Egyptian authorities, and instead of agreeing not to do this work any longer, she said, it emboldened me even more because I saw how abusive this government actually was. And you saw Ismayilova in Azerbaijan say, they put pictures of me up on the internet having sex with my boyfriend to threaten me and blackmail me, the worst thing you can do to a woman in this country, but I didn't back down. I continued to do the work. I think you see this courage of conviction, this willingness to endure any punishment and any suffering because the conviction of the rightness of the work is so potent. There's another aspect that I think is very important as well, even though it's a little elusive, which is that this kind of courage can be very contagious. A lot of times now when I go around the world and I give interviews, people always ask me, they say the US government was threatening to arrest you if you came back to the United States. The British government detained your husband while passing through the airport in London. They were threatening Laura Poitras, my colleague, in all kinds of ways. They marched into the newsroom of The Guardian, the newspaper where I was working, and they smashed the laptops on which the material was being kept. They were menacing in all kinds of ways. And people say, why did you continue to do this work in the face of all these threats? And honestly, the answer for me is that once I saw this 29-year-old willing to sacrifice his own life so courageously in pursuit of this principle, that courage became infectious, it became contagious, and every person around our work became similarly emboldened. People who do this kind of work, this heroic whistleblowing, don't just change themselves, they change the society and everybody that they interact with and everybody that they touch, and I think we've seen that in those videos as well. And then the last point I want to make about my own experience before I apply it to the three finalists is what the nature of power is. I think we all like to talk about power in a courageous way. We all love to say it's important for activists and journalists to stand up to the powerful, to speak truth to power. These are things that we all like to talk about. But I think every now and then it's important to take a moment and ask what it is that we mean when we say that somebody is actually powerful. What does that actually mean? We say it a lot. We use that adjective a lot. What does that actually denote? And for me, the essence of power is that somebody has the ability to issue to you decrees about what they want you to do or what they don't want you to do. And then if you're disobedient to those decrees, they have the power, the capacity to impose on you negative consequences. They can cause suffering for you, they can put you in prison, they can kill you, they can ruin your reputation, they can do all the things that we just saw in these videos are being done to the three finalists tonight. And so I think that it's important to understand that power is not an abstract concept when you're fighting against it. It's something very real and very tangible
and very serious, and it's something that really does deter a lot of rational, reasonable people. It's rational and reasonable not to want to incur those consequences. It takes something almost special for people to be willing to endure it. So with that framework in mind, with that prism in mind of how I understand heroic anti-corruption crusades and people who demand transparency and accountability, I just want to spend some time talking about the three finalists and how I see that they fit into all of this. And before I do, I just want to make an observation about this kind of work. Nicole referenced earlier the fact that there's some controversy surrounding some of the finalists here tonight, as there have been in prior years. And there is. And I think it's really important to note that and be clear about that doing this kind of work is not a popularity contest. You don't always win friends when you stand up to powerful people and you expose their secrets and put them in prison. You oftentimes make a lot of enemies. The work that I did was in some ways recognized and supported and honored around the world. We won a lot of awards, but it's also very divisive. There are people in all kinds of countries who think I belong in prison. There are politicians who have said that about me. There are all kinds of people who think that we made all sorts of mistakes. And so one of the controversies that has surrounded this event is the fact that I happen to live in Brazil, which is the country from which one of the finalists, the Lava Jato prosecutors, also come. And there are a lot of people in Brazil who harbor serious criticisms of what the task force has done, just like there are people in Azerbaijan and Egypt who harbor criticisms about the work that the other two finalists have done. And I have to say that some of those criticisms are not invalid. In fact, I share some of them, and I think I've written about them before. And there was a public pressure campaign against the prize to withdraw the nomination and demanding that I cancel my speaking appearance here in protest of what they've done. And I have to say that notwithstanding the fact that I do think they've made some mistakes, I never for 1 second considered doing that. It never even crossed my mind. And the reason is that I think it's so important to understand that this work is extraordinarily difficult. Not just the work that we see in Brazil, but the work in Egypt and Azerbaijan as well. When you are in Brazil, a country that for decades has run on corruption, it's not a country that has a few corrupt politicians here and there, it's a country that is governed by organized criminality. The entire political system is based on, predicated in, systemic corruption, and they've done it for decades with complete impunity. And so if you are young prosecutors in your 30s, as we saw in the videos most of them are, and you want to take on the richest and most powerful people, there's no instruction manual for how you do that. There's no handbook. There's no guide for what it is that you can do. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to have to be resourceful. You're going to have to make difficult judgment calls. But as an American citizen who watched my own government in the wake of the torture regime and the attack on Iraq protect all the war criminals who engaged in that behavior because they were too powerful to put in prison, and then protect the Wall Street criminals who caused the financial collapse in 2008 that caused economic suffering all around the world, and yet not one person from Wall Street went to prison because they too were too powerful, to watch Brazilians in a young democracy put the most powerful billionaires in prison, and politicians who wield great power from multiple parties across the spectrum to put them in prison as well, notwithstanding the mistakes I think they've made and the very valid critiques that have occasionally been voiced against them, that is something that I consider extraordinarily brave and worthy of support and worthy of being honored. And so I think that what we can say about the Brazilian task force, Lava Jato as we call it in Brazil, car wash as we call it here, what I think we can say about them is that they definitely have not been perfect, but what they have been is very principled and very persistent. And they're really devoted to this idea that they want to change their society from this systemically corrupt one to one in which the rule of law prevails no matter whether you're a black, poor kid from the favela or an extraordinarily rich oligarch born into billions of dollars in wealth. And so I think they embody that first attribute of being ordinary, not having much power, but being devoted to changing the world. Then there's the notion of the contagiousness of courage. I think it's really extraordinary. We all witnessed in the West the demonstrations in Tahrir Square when in 2011 and 2012, huge numbers of Egyptians marched into the streets and demanded the ouster of this savage, horrific dictator, Hosni Mubarak, who was supported for many decades by your government and by mine. And I think that one of the things that you see in Azza Soliman's work is that the courage that was evidenced there became contagious, it became infectious. And I have no doubt that that has emboldened her in so many ways. And I think that it's also worth noting as well this fact that she has a particularly difficult situation, which is that unlike in other countries where the US or Canada are willing to condemn human rights abuses, she is living in a savage dictatorship that is supported by most countries in the West, armed and funded by the United States, supported in lots of ways by Canada. And so she can't really count on Western countries standing up for her. She has to rely instead on voices like those who have gathered here to demand that she be protected. And that makes what she's doing, in my view, all the more courageous. And then there's Khadija in Azerbaijan, who is so extraordinary in so many ways. I guess the one thing that I want to share with you about her, because we just watched her work, is in the course of preparing for this speech, I was looking a lot online, and she has a very strong online presence. She has a really active Twitter account in which she tweets often in English. And one of the things that you saw is that she was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison, and the Supreme Court of the country, mostly due to international pressure, ordered that she be released early. And when she came out of prison in Azerbaijan as an enemy of the state, she didn't come out shattered and looking broken. She came out joyous. In fact, she posed for a picture where she kind of put both of her arms out in the sort of internet shrugging position with this huge radiant smile. And someone took a photo of her that way, and now she has posted that as the pinned picture on her Twitter page. It's an act of incredible defiance. It is saying to the government, you haven't broken me at all. You've actually made me stronger and more determined than ever. And I think that's the ethos that you see running through all of the finalists, and it's the ethos that I saw in Edward Snowden, the other whistleblowers with whom I've worked, like Chelsea Manning and others. It really is a common set of attributes that you find across cultural, nationalistic, and political lines. And the last observation I want to leave you with is, it's so interesting. When I do interviews, I did actually one today for the CBC. I always get asked this question in every single case. People always say to me, Edward Snowden did this heroic thing. He provoked a global debate around the world. And yet now he's trapped in Russia, and it seems like he's probably never going to get out. Isn't it really sad? Do you talk to him? How is he doing? And it's always asked with this kind of pity. I go, he's trapped in this country. He must be so devastated. Now, compared to what we thought was going to be his outcome, which was 6 decades in a maximum security prison in the United States, being trapped in a huge country that he's free to travel in is not that bad. But the more important point is what I always say is that of all the people I know on the planet, Edward Snowden is the single happiest and most content human being I have ever known. Even though he's not free to leave a country that he never chose to be in, where he doesn't speak the language, where he's separated from his family and all of his friends. And the reason is because he gets to put his head on his pillow every night, content in the knowledge that faced with injustices, he was willing to even risk his freedom and his life to fight against them. And that produces a very peaceful state of being. And I don't know the other finalists personally, but I'd be willing to bet that notwithstanding the burdens and difficulties and pressures and attacks that they regularly endure, that they similarly have that internal contentment because they know that what they're doing is right, and that brings about a great deal of happiness. And while it brings happiness for them, what it does for us is it brings a huge amount of civic freedom and safeguard against tyranny and corruption. And so for that reason, I say unreservedly that I'm really honored to be part of an event in which 3 very deserving finalists are being recognized. And I once again want to thank the Allard Prize for protecting their work and for honoring it and for making all of our society stronger and more prosperous as a result. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you for coming and for taking up our invitation. And you know, when one issues an invitation like this, we put a few ideas together and send it off to the individual who we're inviting, and then we sit back and wait and see, I wonder what will happen. And I'd just like to say that I'll slip for a moment into my professorial role and say you've really fulfilled this assignment, and I award you an A+. In fact, one of the things that you've done tremendously for us is to really reinforce the point that the purpose of this evening is not just to announce the Allard Prize, but to recognize the many individuals around the world who've made tremendous sacrifices and are engaged in an ongoing struggle to secure basic human rights. So now we are getting close to the exciting part of the evening, the awarding of the 2017 Allard Prize for International Integrity. And so to help me with this, I would like to ask Mr. Allard and Professor Ono and our honorees to join me here on the stage. And so while folks are making their way up here and getting settled, I'll just tell you a little bit about the design of the award. This special award was the result of a design competition initiated by the Allard Prize Committee, and the winners, who are Greg Saul and Tiago Rourke of Diatom Studio, designed the original art piece that you've been enjoying on the screen behind me and that you will see here tonight. And each individual award produced through this algorithmic technique is ever so slightly different. So each individual or organization or movement gets the award to take home with very slight variations, and it's totally fascinating and interesting. All right, thank you, the two of you, for joining me to help me with this exciting presentation. We're all ready? We're prepared? Okay. On behalf of the Allard School of Law, I have the great privilege of announcing the recipient of the 2017 Allard Prize for International Integrity. This year's recipient is Khadija Ismayilova. To accept the award on behalf of Khadija Ismayilova, I'd like to invite her colleague Kenan Aliyev to please come forward.
It's very heavy.
And now I'm going to invite you to the podium, and the part of the evening that I just don't know how it happens is who gets to hold the award while you say a few words, and perhaps the president or Mr. Allard would be entrusted with that for a few moments. Please.
Thank you. Oh, what a day. First of all, thank you so much for this great honor. For me, it's a great honor to be here. My last name is Aliyev, like President's last name. So Khadija is giving a lot of trouble to Aliyevs. One is going to be investigated, and I'm being sent here to accept the award. But it's a good part, so I enjoy it. So again, my name is Kenan Aliyev, and I worked for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, since I was a teenager to promote press freedom in Azerbaijan and elsewhere in the post-Soviet space. But it's my relationship with Khadija, my bureau chief in Baku, my colleague, my best friend, who spent a year and a half in prison, my dear friend, that brings me here tonight. I hired Khadija almost 10 years ago to work for us in Baku. It was her birthday, and she accepted my offer to be a bureau chief graciously, and since then she never stopped surprising us in a good way. If Khadija were here, and we all hear a statement from her in a moment, I know she would graciously accept the award, but she would direct attention to the political prisoners that are still in prison in Azerbaijan. Those journalists who cannot be heard, the activists who are being persecuted and punished for questioning and criticizing, and the work that remains to be done. She would, above all, be humble. But I want to tell you why Khadija is great. Who is she really like? She's stubborn, she's relentless, she's strong, and she's unstoppable, not only in her pursuit of truth and justice, but in her humanity. And here I will open the one story she shared with me after she left the jail. So while she was in prison, she would sing opera, loud, every day. She refused to be silenced. So guards were very angry with her because every day they would hear like Khadija singing in her cell. And also she persuaded her cellmates to sing with her. And she helped them. She attended to their needs. So guards were very happy when she left the jail. And apparently she has a great voice. So I want to tell you what she accomplished. Her investigative work has exposed massive corruption in Azerbaijan and mobilized international attention around flagrant efforts by Azeri officials to corrupt democratic institutions like Council of Europe and some political processes in the West and elsewhere. She has reported what no one else dared to. Billions of dollars assets owned by President and his family members were basically brought to the light thanks to Khadija's work. But most importantly, I want to tell you what her work means for us, the journalists, human rights defenders, and democracy activists gathered here and elsewhere. She has shown us that truth matters. She has shown us how to fight and not to be afraid. And she has proven that human dignity is not for sale. And she has given us hope. She asked me to convey her request to law scholars and students tonight. In countries like Azerbaijan, citizens fail to find justice in corruption litigations. Khadija asks international lawyers to suggest international litigation options for citizens of authoritarian countries in their fight against corruption. Maybe this is the time to think about international court, anti-corruption court, and this idea has been around for a long time. Because authoritarian regimes are enjoying impunity because they control the judiciary in their countries. So Khadija's request was in that direction. You know, one of the accusations brought against her during the trial was that she drove someone to commit suicide. So the kind of prosecution was looking for ways how to put her in jail, and this one of the accusations was that she kind of inflicted moral damage on someone and who was about to commit suicide. So government was struggling to find case against her, and they failed. And she's free, but she cannot be here. But I hope she's watching. I sent her a link, and I think she will be very proud, like all of us, and I'm very proud of her. And I would like to thank Allard Prize Committee for honoring her work. This is great recognition, and it was a message to the people of Azerbaijan and the journalists in Azerbaijan that you are not alone. And Khadija is not alone, and this prize is recognition of that. And now we will hear from Khadija.
Yes.
Thank you.
Dear friends, I'm very sorry for not being there with you in person. Unfortunately, the government decided that I should stay in the country. They didn't lift the travel ban I'm a subject to. I'm one of the many journalists who are facing the same kind of travel ban in Azerbaijan. Most of them are the journalists like me who are uncovering corruption in this country. Corrupt officials help each other to harass journalists in their countries. They arrest journalists on the orders of each other. They shut down the media organizations. They deliver journalists from one country to another. It happens all the time in Azerbaijan, in Russia, in Turkey, in Georgia, in Armenia, in all of the post-Soviet area. The only thing we can do is being together. And not only us journalists, also the society, the other sectors of society, and especially lawyers should be together with media in uncovering corruption and fighting it. What we can do together is, first of all, bring justice to all these cases and make sure that all those who try to silence journalists by killing, beating, or arresting them would be held responsible by the world community. So all we can do is be together, stand together against those who are stealing opportunities from their own people and who are trying to silence journalists for uncovering this inconvenient truth. And thank you for nominating me for this prize. I accept it as an acknowledgement of our efforts, not only my efforts, but also the efforts of many other journalists who sometimes even cannot put their names on their stories because their families and themselves are subject for government threats and harassments. And I accept this as an acknowledgement of their efforts and their work that is so important for better future of our societies.
Thank you so much, Kenan. Well, it was an extremely difficult task for the Allard Prize Committee to select just one winner from amongst the honorees. All are extraordinary and deserving. And as such, I am delighted to make a special announcement this evening that Azza Soliman and the Car Wash Task Force will each be recognized with honorable mention awards and cash prizes. As well as, of course, actual Allard Prizes themselves. So we've asked each honorable mention recipient to say a few words, and let's begin with Azza Soliman's award and Ms. Iman Mandour. So please come forward to first receive the award. Then we'll figure out the way that maybe Mr. Allard will hold it, and I'll get my notes out of the way. Would you be the custodian of the award? Please.
Well, the work of Azza defines very much who she is. It's very, very difficult to separate Azza from what she does. So in this note that is prepared by Azza, I see it as a very personal note, even though she is speaking about what she is doing as well and what she's going through. So it's a note that is prepared by Azza, translated by her son, presented by me here not only as her colleague but as her friend. So I see this as a very intimate trio presenting that. Dear Allard Prize Committee, ladies, gentlemen, and everyone along the spectrum, greetings from Egypt. I would have loved to be standing in front of you all tonight. I would have loved to experience all of this appreciation and gratitude to my journey in the human rights field by being physically here. Unfortunately, it is because of this struggle to halt injustice and oppression from ruining the lives of millions of Egyptian women every day that I couldn't make it today. It is because of my belief in the rule of law and empowerment that I have to go through these harsh circumstances. It is because of these beliefs and actions that I have to face arbitrary, unjust, and illegal measures that alone aim at silencing me. Ladies and gentlemen, showing this appreciation, love, and solidarity is of crucial importance to human rights defenders. It helps us keep going as we try to create a new world that is free of rampant violations of women's rights and human rights. This support and solidarity helps me continue my struggle for justice, equality, and love. It helps me keep going until I achieve my dream. Make no mistake, it is far from easy sometimes to endure this suffering. I do have my low points. It is at these points where people like you showing support are able to remind me that I am not alone and I have no other option but to keep going. May we one day experience a world that is full of love, peace, freedom, prosperity for all, and equality. Thank you.
Appreciate for this. This is motivate me to continue with my work, especially under this regime in Egypt. Unfortunately, I am not with you, but I feeling all your support. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing those moving words, Imam. And I would now like to invite one of the representatives from the Car Wash Task Force, Mr. Deltan Dagnol, to please come forward first to receive on behalf of the whole task force the award, and then I'll invite you to the podium.
Well, I'd like to invite my colleagues to be here with me. Paulo, Ataíde, and Jerusa, please. We have been under very harsh circumstances together, and each circumstance unites us more and more. We just stick together, we can't help. From a small-scale money laundering scheme, the car wash investigation led us to discover criminal conducts of almost one-third of the ministers of state, almost one-third of the senators, and almost a half of the state governors in Brazil. So far, more than 280 persons were charged with corruption, criminal organization, and money laundering. Hundreds of politicians of more than 26 different political parties were implicated. How was it possible to face and fight such powerful scheme? Before answering that, I would like to say good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Car Wash Task Force and the Federal Prosecution Service in Brazil, I'd like to thank the Allard Prize for putting together this great initiative to recognize and incentivize the fight against corruption as a necessary building block to promote development and human rights around the world. We feel honored to be among such outstanding nominees. Fighting against corruption is not an end in itself, but it's a means to promote human rights. Estimations point out that corruption diverts in Brazil more than $60 billion per year. That money could mean giving drinkable water to more than 35 million Brazilians who do not have it. It could mean health, education, safety. Shortly, it could mean a better life to 200 million Brazilians. We hope that our effort may contribute to build this, human rights for those who are entitled to them but barely have any. And so, how was it possible to stand against the cruelty of corruption when such powerful people were involved? Of course, there was an innovative work of a huge team of public officials. But much more important than that, it was the immense support of Brazilian society and its will to change which built Car Wash case. In a democracy, the ultimate power is that of the people. And if we were able to do that together as Brazilians, the message that we would like to send here is that you can, other citizens can, and we together can, whatever the good cause is, face injustices and keep the hope of creating a better future and a better world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Delton, and all of you for joining us on the stage. So now, as we get close to the end of the evening, please join me once again in congratulating all of tonight's winners and thanking Mr. Greenwald. It's wonderful to see you on your feet, and I know that we are going to send photos of that beautiful image to Azza and to Khadija, who are not able to be with us this evening. So thank you, everyone, for attending. And for those of you who are in the room, the night is young. We ask that you join us at Allard Hall for refreshments, and as you are leaving, staff will be available to point you in the right direction. I would like, because there was so much applause for our honorees, that my second round of thanks to Mr. Greenwald was drowned out a bit there, and it really was just the perfect compliment to the evening indeed.